This is a modern Boeing 787 and not your rustic tractor," Captain Dillon sneered, casting a contemptuous glance at Mac's worn-out leather jacket. He thought the gold badge on his chest was a supreme pass, while the old man was just a senile fool unworthy of speaking up. His brazen laughter echoed in the cockpit, treating the humiliation of others as a privilege of the superior. But just a few seconds later, the atmosphere suddenly shifted. When the fighter jet missile had locked onto the target, it was that very country bumpkin who was the only one calm enough to shove Dillon aside to snatch life back from the hands of death. The entire runway fell dead silent. It turned out, he was not a nameless nobody. He was Ugly Six, a legend of the aviation industry. The man whom even the airline director had to bow down to in deep respect. In the moment the truth was laid bare, fear invaded the mind, causing the arrogant Captain Dillon to suddenly shrink away, becoming small and pathetically base before the overwhelming shadow of the veteran. Storms do not create heroes. They only reveal the cowards hiding behind the glory. Please share this story if you believe that true class does not lie in the uniform we drape over ourselves, but lies in the metal we display when facing death. Pitch-black darkness enveloped the North Atlantic Ocean, swallowing the Boeing 787 as it glided between massive charged cloud masses. Outside the thick reinforced glass, an unseasonal storm was growling like a wounded beast, tearing apart the night with jagged purple lightning streaks. But at an altitude of 35,000 feet, inside the perfectly soundproofed metal shell of the first-class cabin, the ferocity of nature seemed merely like a lavish light show, staged exclusively for the elite. The atmosphere here was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, blending with the gentle aroma of aged Chardonnay wine, and the delicate clinking of crystal glasses colliding with one another. Dillon stepped out of the cockpit with the leisurely demeanor of a king strolling through his own palace. His hand-tailored captain uniform hugged his tall physique, the golden epaulets reflecting the warm yellow light, and his hair was gelled so meticulously that not a single strand dared to be out of place. He was the perfect face that the airline always sought: young, handsome, and radiating the absolute confidence of the digital age generation of pilots. To Dillon, the sky was not a battlefield to be conquered, but a pre-programmed space where every risk had been eliminated by complex lines of command code. He stopped by the seat of a female VIP passenger, who was anxiously looking out at the streaks of light flashing continuously outside the window. Dillon leaned down, flashing an industrial smile practiced thousands of times before the mirror, and his warm, deep voice rang out, "Ma'am, please do not let the fireworks display out there disturb your sleep. With this state-of-the-art autopilot system, I actually only come up to the cockpit to drink coffee and stargaze. This plane is smarter than any pilot who has ever lived, and it knows how to avoid storms even better than we avoid traffic jams down on the ground." The woman giggled, the fear in her eyes vanishing instantly before that deadly charm. Dillon nodded slightly in greeting and continued striding along the velvet-carpeted aisle, enjoying the admiring gazes following his back. He loved this feeling, the sensation of being worshipped like a god holding the lives of hundreds of people, even though deep down, he knew clearly that he was essentially just a high-level system manager, a supervisor of the computers that were actually doing the work of flying. Arrogance crept into every one of Dillon's cells, and he despised the old rules, the instinctual fears that the geriatric generation of pilots often mentioned. The era of feeling the flight was dead, for now was the era of touchscreens and digital data. But when Dillon pulled aside the curtain separating the seat classes to step down into the economy area, the atmosphere changed abruptly, as if he had just stepped through a spatial portal. The scent of luxury perfume disappeared, replaced by a mixed odor of sweat, of hastily heated meals, and stifling anxiety. The further he walked toward the tail of the plane, the more violent the shaking became. The passengers here did not have wine or seats that reclined into beds to soothe their nerves, as they only had hard plastic armrests to grip tightly whenever the plane lurched. Dillon smirked, a sneer flashing across his handsome face. He looked at the crowd, squeezing their eyes shut to pray whenever the plane entered turbulence, silently thinking about the weakness of those ignorant of aerodynamics. In the last row, where the effects of G-force and engine noise were heaviest, an older man was sitting curled up against the window. Thomas Mackenzie, or Mac as he was also known, looked completely out of place compared to the flashy modernity of the plane. He wore an earth-brown leather jacket worn down to the point of revealing the inner lining, with a popped collar obscuring half of his face tanned dark by sun and wind. His deep-set eyes did not look at the entertainment screen in front of him, nor did they close to escape motion sickness. Instead, they were glued to the pitch-black darkness outside the window. where the airplane wing was vibrating intensely with every gust of wind. On Mac's lap was a cracked, leather-bound flight logbook, with yellowed pages covered in numbers and calculation formulas hastily written in pencil. His rough fingers tapped a rhythm on the cover, not following a tune, but counting the beat. He was listening. Amidst the roaring noise of the jet engines and the wind whistling through the door gaps, the hearing of a veteran mechanic and pilot had filtered out a strange sound. It was not the wind slamming into the fuselage, nor the smooth operation of the turbine. It was a piercing, intermittent screech, like the cry of metal being pushed to its endurance limit. Mac pressed his ear close to the cold cabin wall, closing his eyes to feel the vibration frequency transmitting through the frame. Trying to decode the deadly message this metal monster was whispering. Suddenly, the plane missed a beat violently, as if it had just stepped into an invisible hole in the sky. The entire passenger cabin gasped in terror. A stewardess pushing a cart stumbled and would have fallen over if Dylan's strong arm had not caught her in time. He held her back with a skillful move, flashing a reassuring smile, then leaned close to her ear, with a tone full of condescension. "Look at these little lambs. Just a little bump and their faces are drained of blood. It is truly laughable that they think a few petty gusts of wind can trouble me." Just as Dylan intended to turn and walk away, a hoarse voice, rough as gravel, grinding together, rang out. Halting his steps, "Check the left wing fuel intake valve." "Captain." Dylan froze, his groomed eyebrows knitting together in annoyance. He slowly turned his head, his gaze sweeping down over the person who had just spoken. Mac had raised his head, revealing sharp eyes hidden under the brim of an old baseball cap. Those eyes did not contain fear or pleading like the other passengers, but contained the determination and authority of someone who had faced death too many times. Mac did not care about Dylan's flashy appearance. He only cared about the safety of the flight. He tapped his finger on the notebook, continuing to speak, every word as solid as a driven nail. "That screeching sound is not wind. It is uneven pressure. The intake valve is stuck open, causing a water hammer phenomenon in the pipeline. If you do not rebalance the fuel tank immediately, the aircraft's center of gravity will shift to the left, and the autopilot system will be unable to compensate for the banking angle when the wind gusts harder." The surrounding space seemed to sag for a few seconds. Passengers sitting nearby stopped praying, staring blankly at the sloppily dressed man who had just uttered incomprehensible technical terms. Dylan stared at Mac, then his gaze slid from the rugged face down to the worn leather jacket, the sole-worn shoes, and the cracked notebook. A wave of contempt welled up in the heart of the young captain. He felt insulted. A guy who looked like a homeless person who had just snuck up from the cargo hold dared to teach him, a star of the airline, how to operate this Boeing 787 worth hundreds of millions of dollars. To Dylan, Mac represented everything he loathed: senility, backwardness, and poverty. He believed in electronic sensors accurate to the millisecond, in liquid crystal screens displaying brilliant parameters, not in the senile ears and tattered notebook of a rustic old man. Mac's warning, instead of making Dylan alert, triggered his massive, arrogant ego. He stood up straight, adjusted the lapel of his crisp vest, and laughed out loud. His laughter echoed in the cabin, which was silent with fear, sounding ear-piercing and full of mockery. He wanted to use this humiliation to assert his absolute power here, to show everyone who the real master of the sky was. Dylan turned to the stewardess still standing next to him, raised his voice loudly, deliberately letting the entire passenger cabin hear every single word, turning Mac's life and death warning into a cheap entertainment joke amidst the storm. "Look, ladies and gentlemen, we have a brilliant aviation expert sitting right here in economy class." Dylan's sarcastic remark was like a spark thrown into a tense crowd, triggering giggles of relief from the surrounding rows. Passengers began to look at Thomas Mackenzie as a troublemaker, a senile old man obsessed with distant war memories rather than a real threat. Dylan noticed the crowd effect tilting in his favor, so he smirked, deciding to push this display of power to its climax. He no longer stood straight but leaned down low, invading Mac's meager personal space, pressing his handsome, well-groomed face close to the veteran's wrinkled, sun-tanned face. The strong scent of expensive perfume from Dylan assaulted Mac's nose, contrasting sharply with the smell of old leather and cheap tobacco emanating from the frayed jacket. Dylan lowered his voice to a whisper, but that volume was calculated just enough so that people sitting in the 2 rows in front and behind could clearly hear every word, like a verdict for ignorance. He tapped his long, slender finger on the cabin wall, right where Mac had just pressed his ear against, an action full of condescension like a teacher instructing a delinquent student. Listen, old man, what are you talking about? The tractor back in the countryside or this Boeing 787 Dreamliner worth $300 million? Do you know how many sensors this plane is equipped with? Thousands. It has 3 independent monitoring computer systems, automatically cross-checking each other millions of times per second. If the fuel intake valve had a problem, even just a loose screw, the screen in my cockpit would light up like a Christmas tree. As for you, what do you rely on? Your deaf ears? Dylan paused for a beat to observe Mac's reaction, but the old man still sat still as a stone statue, his eyes never leaving the pitch-black window. That calmness only irritated Dylan more. He wanted to see fear, submission, or at least shame on that rugged face. He continued to attack, his words becoming increasingly harsh, striking directly at the professional pride he guessed was the only thing left of this man. Your era is over. The time when pilots had to wrestle with the yoke, had to listen to the engine to diagnose illnesses, died along with those old warplanes of yours. Now is the digital era. We fly by data, by algorithms, not by feeling. So, please keep those obsolete experiences to yourself. Just take a sleeping pill, have a deep sleep, and never, I repeat, never teach me how to fly a plane. Dylan's concluding sentence was like a knife severing any minimum respect between two human beings. The surrounding passengers, who just a moment ago were bewildered and fearful because of the strange screeching sound, now found a false sense of security in the arrogance of the young captain. They began to whisper, pointing at Mac with eyes full of pity mixed with mockery. A few shook their heads, whispering to each other that this old man must be senile due to age, or maybe due to some psychological sequelae. They chose to believe in the crisp uniform, in Dylan's confident smile rather than believe in a rough warning coming from a person who looked no different from a homeless man. Thomas Mackenzie still did not argue back a single word. He did not look up to face Dylan's provocative gaze, nor did he turn around to explain to those who were mocking him. He understood clearly the price of silence, but he understood even more clearly the futility of arguing with those who are deaf, not because they cannot hear, but because they will not listen. Mac's old, calloused hand slowly raised, pulling the brim of his baseball cap down low to cover his deep-set eyes, as if wanting to isolate himself from this noisy and shallow world. He sighed a deep sigh, a heavy sigh carrying the helplessness of someone seeing a disaster beforehand but unable to stop it. Inside his chest, his old heart still beat rhythms of anxiety, but reason told him that the time to act had not yet come. He clutched the notebook tightly in his lap, his thumb rubbing gently over the scribbled lines of notes, waiting for the cruel judgment of physics, the only thing in this world that does not know how to lie. Dylan, seeing Mac's resigned reaction, was extremely smug. He considered that silence a confession of defeat, a surrender to his absolute authority. He stood up straight, adjusted his tie, and swept his eyes around once to receive the admiration of the crowd. He waved to signal the chief stewardess, speaking loudly with an air of bestowing a favor. Do not serve him alcohol anymore. It seems this passenger is suffering from altitude sickness. Bring him a glass of water and a blanket. Let him dream about his glorious old days. Having finished speaking, Dylan turned his back and walked away, leaving behind buzzing laughter of approval. He strode down the narrow aisle, head held high, enjoying the feeling of victory of someone who had just successfully quelled a rebellion. He did not know that the very moment he turned his back on Mac was also the moment he turned his back on his own last chance of survival. Arrogance had blindfolded him, making him ignore the most precious warning he had ever received in his flying life. Dylan returned to the cockpit, slamming the bulletproof door shut, separating the noisy, chaotic world behind his back. The space in the cockpit was quiet and cold, with only the soft humming sound of electronic devices and the blue light emitted from dozens of LCD screens. The co-pilot, a young man, even more inexperienced than Dylan, was intently looking at the weather radar screen with a worried face. "Boss, you were gone for so long. Is there something happening back there?" the co-pilot asked, his eyes never leaving the reddish cloud masses on the map. Dylan dropped himself into the captain's seat, fastened his seatbelt lazily, rested his feet on the footrest under the control panel, and laughed faintly. "Nothing at all. Just a senile old man who likes to show off." He said, "The left-wing fuel intake valve is broken." "Can you believe it? Broken, but the system doesn't show a yellow light." Truly the funniest story tonight. The co-pilot hesitated a bit, then said, "But boss, just now I saw the flow meter needle fluctuate slightly. Very small, but it wasn't very stable." Dylan waved his hand, dismissing his subordinate's worry immediately. That is due to atmospheric turbulence. You are being too sensitive. The computer system has automatically balanced it already. If there was a serious error, then the alarm bell would have deafened you and me by now. Focus on monitoring the radar. Outside the windshield, the night sky began to change. The lightning bolts no longer struck sporadically, but knitted together into massive electrical webs enveloping the Iron Bird. What Dylan and his modern computer system did not foresee was that they were flying into the center of an extremely strong magnetic storm. The Earth's magnetic field in this area was being disturbed violently, creating invisible waves attacking the satellite navigation devices. On the navigation screen, the aircraft position cursor began to show signs of jumping jerkily. GPS parameters, originally considered an immutable compass, were now being bent by the power of nature. Satellite signals flickered, on and off, but the autopilot software programmed to smooth data hid that deadly deviation. It still displayed the aircraft as being on the safe flight path, while in reality, the extremely strong swirling winds of the storm were silently pushing the Boeing to drift into a completely different direction. The signal light on the left wing, where Mac had warned, began to flicker unusually to the rhythm of a local short-circuit incident. But from the cockpit position, Dylan could not see the airplane wing behind his back. He reached out to grab an aviation magazine, flipped through a few pages, completely trusting that autopilot mode was doing its job well. He was completely unaware that, with every passing second, his blind confidence was taking 300 passengers far away from the safe flight path, advancing deep into a dark sky zone where civil law was no longer effective. The giant airplane, like a blind whale amidst a stormy ocean, was silently changing direction. It was not flying toward the destination predetermined on the passengers' tickets. It was drifting along a deadly trajectory, heading straight toward an empty sea area on the civil map, but marked in bright red on the military map with the name, No-Fly Zone, Firepower Level 1. Dylan still sat there, sipping the coffee just brought up, dreaming vaguely about a luxurious dinner at the destination, while death was beginning to count down every single mile on this fateful journey. 2 hours passed in a false tranquility, a period of time long enough for Dylan's complacency to take root deep into every corner of the cockpit, but also long enough for the deadly error to accumulate into an irreversible disaster. The Boeing 787 was still gliding through the night, but it was no longer on the safe commercial flight corridor outlined on the map. Under the silent impact of the magnetic storm and the captain's subjective dismissal of the warnings, the giant Iron Bird had been pushed, drifting hundreds of miles to the southeast, straying into a deadly sea area where there was no civil law, only the cold rules of military engagement. In the cockpit, the pitch-dark space was only illuminated by the faint blue light from dozens of touchscreens and indicator lights. Dylan rested his feet on the footrest, his eyes idly skimming through a lifestyle magazine for the elite, occasionally taking a sip of coffee that had gone completely cold. The co-pilot sitting next to him, although still maintaining the duty of monitoring, had also been lulled into lowering his guard by the boss's excessive confidence. They trusted absolutely in the numbers displayed on the screen, on course, going in the right direction, but they did not know that the inertial navigation system had been disturbed to the point of creating a virtual reality on its own, deceiving both the computer and the humans. Suddenly, a strange vibration ran along the fuselage, not like the shaking due to aerodynamics but like a collision with an invisible energy wall. The central navigation screen flickered madly, the position cursor dancing chaotically on the digital map, then suddenly turning off, leaving behind a deadly black color. Before Dylan could understand what was happening, the entire ship's electrical system encountered a serious incident due to entering the zone of extremely strong magnetic field interference of the military area. The lights in the passenger cabin suddenly went out completely. The melodious music, the soft humming of the air conditioner, all disappeared in a split second, giving way to thick darkness and terrifying silence. Hundreds of passengers who were sinking into sleep or watching movies suddenly fell into a state of panic. Screams of terror rang out, the sounds of children crying loudly, the sounds of food trays being knocked over crashing. But the real horror did not come from the darkness inside, but came from the light outside. A roar tore apart the night, a high-frequency sound so ear-piercing that it made everyone's chest vibrate intensely, completely drowning out the smooth engine sound of the civil aircraft. Outside the window, The night was torn apart by two brilliant violet-blue streams of light, scorching hot and ferocious. Two giant black shadows, angular and sharp as the blades of death, pressed right up against both sides of the 787's wings. They were so close that passengers pressing their faces against the glass could clearly see every single rivet on the alloy shell. See even the warning line danger. Intake on the engine air intake. Those were two F-35 Lightning II stealth fighters of the United States Navy. Sky monsters, armed to the teeth, conducting live fire exercises in the no-fly zone area. For the fighter pilots, the sudden appearance of a giant flying object emitting no identification signal, looming into the middle of their combat formation, was no different from a provocative act or a reckless threat. In the cockpit, Dylan's calmness shattered like a piece of glass hit by a hammer. He sprang up, spilling the cup of coffee onto the control panel, his trembling hands trying to cling to the yoke, but everything seemed to be paralyzed. He looked over at the co-pilot, whose face was now drained of blood, mouth stuttering soundlessly, as he looked at the black shadow covering the right window. That was not a friendly aircraft. Those were predators. Immediately, the radio communication system, the only thing still functioning stably, emitted an ear-piercing crackle. Then a voice rang out. It was not the gentle voice of air traffic control, but a voice icy cold, steel hard, and containing no humane emotion of a soldier on duty. Unidentified target. This is the United States Navy. You have violated a firepower level 1 zone, suspected to be a camouflaged reconnaissance aircraft. Request to dip wings to confirm identity and land immediately, or we will open fire. Dylan grabbed the headset, cold sweat pouring out like a bath soaking his shirt back. He tried to calm down, tried to find back that usual condescending voice, but his throat felt like it was being strangled by someone. He pressed the transmit button, but instead of coherent sentences, what came out was only the pathetic stuttering of someone who had never tasted the scent of life and death. This is commercial flight 404. My system reports. Dylan's weak explanation was cut off brutally. For the F-35 pilots, hesitation and straying into a forbidden zone with no prior warning signal were typical signs of an attack or espionage plot. They had no time to negotiate with intruders. The rules of engagement in the red zone were very simple: comply or be destroyed. Outside, the F-35 on the left performed a sharp wing dip maneuver, revealing the aircraft belly bristling with deadly weapons. A heat-seeking air-to-air missile, massive and terrifying, lay silently under the weapon pylon, but its seeker head had begun searching for the heat source from the Boeing's engines, the collision warning system and radar in Dylan's cockpit. After a while of paralysis, suddenly came back to life, only to report bad news. The alarm siren howled continuously, red lights flashing madly all over the control panel. The sound, beep, 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 rang out rapidly, which was the sound of radar locking onto the target, the most haunting sound that any pilot fears. It signaled that they were no longer a means of transport. They had become prey sitting right in the crosshairs. Dylan looked at the screen, looked at the bright red numbers dancing, then looked out the window where the muzzle of the god of death was pointing straight at him. He turned to the co-pilot, seeking help, a solution, or at least sympathy, but the co-pilot had given up, hands holding his head slumped down, completely paralyzed by fear. Dylan realized he was completely alone. All the flashiness, degrees, the title of face of the airline, the praises of VIP passengers, all were meaningless before this brutal military power. He screamed in despair, hands slamming hard onto the lifeless control panel. Where is the computer? Why did it not report the no-fly zone? Why? His question fell into the void. The computer did not answer. It only displayed cold error code lines. And then, the voice of the F-35 pilot rang out once again, this time no longer a warning, but a death sentence read out before the hour of execution. Target not complying. Missile locked. This is the final warning. You have 10 seconds to change flight direction before we open fire. Starting countdown 10, 9. In the passenger cabin, chaos reached its peak. People sitting by the windows saw the greenish flame halo from the F-35 engine. They screamed in despair, "It is about to shoot, we are about to die." Others hugged each other tightly, parents shielding their children, prayers ringing out in tears. They did not know that their fate was lying in the hands of a captain who had completely lost the ability to control, a person trembling waiting for death in his comfortable cockpit. The countdown sound still echoed, cold and cruel, knocking every beat into Dylan's panicked mind. 8, 7. Imagine you are at an altitude of 10,000 meters, looking out the window and seeing the fighter jet's muzzle pointing straight at you. In this life and death moment, when the flashy captain has been paralyzed by fear, where will you place your bet for your life? Please leave a comment predicting what will happen next. The countdown ringing in the cockpit no longer sounded like a human voice. It had turned into the knock of death, cold and steady to the point of cruelty. 8, 7, 6. Each number fell like a hammer blow, nailing the metal coffin, hurtling at subsonic speed through the night sky. In the cramped space reeking of spilled coffee and the sweat of fear, time seemed to be bent, stretched out into agonizingly long moments. Dylan sat frozen in the captain's seat, eyes staring wide at the indeterminate void, pupils dilated to the max, but no longer receiving any images from the series of screens flashing bright red alarms in front of him. His body shook violently, a trembling originating from deep within the spinal cord, where the primal survival instinct was screaming in despair. He wanted to move, wanted to pull the yoke, wanted to do something to save his life, but his nervous system had completely collapsed under the enormous pressure. The flashy image of a star captain, who was always confident with a permanent smile on his lips, had now vanished like a soap bubble, leaving only a lost and cowardly child waiting for the final punishment. Outside the windshield, the F-35 monster still doggedly clung close, its cold metal belly opened, revealing the missile warhead locking tight onto the heat stream emitted from the 787's engines. Suddenly, a loud noise rang out from behind, drowning out the siren screaming loudly. The armored cockpit door, originally designed to stop terrorists, was pushed hard from the outside. Thomas Mackenzie walked in, no longer the hunched, rugged appearance of an old man sitting curled up in the economy seat just now. Mac stood there, back straight, broad shoulders opening up to block the entire aisle, exuding a steadiness and dignity that was strangely extraordinary. The frayed leather jacket on him seemed no longer a sign of poverty, but became the weather-beaten armor of a warrior just returned from hell. His deep-set eyes no longer held a look of fatigue. Instead, there was the burning fire of intense concentration, the light that only appears in those who have tasted the boundary between life and death. Dylan spun around, face distorted with panic. When seeing Mac, the fear in him exploded into a frenzied rage, a weak defensive reaction of someone being cornered. He screamed, voice breaking like tearing metal, "Get out! What are you doing in here, you crazy fool? We are about to die. No one can save us." Mac did not answer. He had no time for explanations or meaningless arguments. He walked forward, steps solid and decisive, brushing past the co-pilot who was holding his head trembling. When he reached Dylan's side, he did not hesitate at all. His rough hand, calloused from grease and years of piloting ancient combat aircraft, swung up, swatting away the hand that was unconsciously clinging to Dylan's seat armrest. Slap. A dry sound rang out, cutting through the flow of panic in the cockpit. Mac had slapped Dylan. It was not a blow of violence or personal vendetta. The force was also not too strong to cause injury, but it was decisive enough, painful enough to create a physical shock, forcing Dylan's brain paralyzed by hysteria to reboot. That slap contained the sternness of a teacher, the authority of a commander, and also the contempt for cowardice. Dylan was stunned, holding one burning cheek, looking up at Mac with eyes full of astonishment. The frenzied panic temporarily subsided, giving way to a deadly silence. Mac grabbed Dylan's crisp shirt collar, pulling him close to the cockpit window glass, where the F-35 monster was pointing its gun muzzle at them. He gritted his voice, the deep sound resonating from his chest, powerful as rolling thunder drowning out the countdown ticking the final seconds. "Shut up and look out there. What do you see that is reality? Kid, you are letting your stupid computer fly us straight into the muzzle of the military. Wake up before it turns you into dust." Mac's words were like a bucket of cold water thrown straight into Dylan's face, forcing him to face the naked truth. The digital screen he worshipped, the autopilot system he trusted absolutely, was now the traitor leading him to death. Dylan looked out, saw the greenish flame from the combat jet engine, saw death taking shape clearer than ever. He shuddered, but this time not from panic, but from realization. Mac did not wait for Dylan to answer. He shoved Dylan down into the co-pilot seat, taking over the command position. The moment he sat in the captain's seat, Mac seemed to merge as one with this giant machine. His old but agile fingers glided over the complex control panel with an amazing speed, without a single superfluous movement. He did not need to look at the instruction manual, did not need to wait for the system to respond. The muscle memory of tens of thousands of flight hours had risen, controlling his hands to perform operations precise as a surgery. He reached out to the central control panel, where the autopilot activation button was glowing a soft blue. With a decisive flick, Mac turned it off. A dry click sound rang out. The blue light went out, replaced by the yellow warning light, manual control lighting up. Immediately, the plane shuddered violently, no longer having the soft intervention of the computer to cancel out vibrations. Dylan felt clearly the weight of the 300-ton monster struggling with the storm. The yoke vibrated intensely in Mac's hands, transmitting all the rage of nature into the palms of the old pilot. But Mac did not flinch. He held the yoke tight, eyes narrowing, feeling the breath of the plane through every fiber of muscle. The countdown on the radio continued to ring out, cold and cruel, signaling the fateful moment was coming very close. 4, 3, time was running out. Mac knew that changing flight direction at this moment was impossible to avoid the heat-seeking missile that had locked onto the target. A civil aircraft was too heavy, too slow compared to the reflexes of modern weapon systems. The only way to survive was not to run away, but to dialogue. But he could not use the normal civil communication channel, the thing that Dylan had used to stammer meaningless words. He needed another path, a shortcut, going straight into the minds of those holding guns out there. Mac reached up to the radio control panel. Instead of choosing the standard VHF frequencies for civil aviation, his fingers turned the adjustment knob decisively, switching to the UHF frequency band, a special military frequency band. These were old frequencies, often forgotten in peacetime, only used in top-secret emergency situations or between veteran combat squadrons. A new generation civil pilot like Dylan did not even know of the existence of this band, or if he knew he would never dare to touch it. But for Mac, this was an old home. He remembered every number, every frequency like remembering his home phone number. His eyes were glued to the countdown clock on the F-35's radar screen displaying through the common communication channel. The number 3 just went out. The number 2 was preparing to appear. That was the final fragile boundary. If past this number without a cancellation command code, the missile would leave the launch pad, and everything would end in a giant fireball in the middle of the ocean. The air in the cockpit was tense, as a string about to snap. Dylan held his breath, eyes wide watching Mac's strange action. The co-pilot squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for the explosion sound. Only Mac remained strangely calm. He took a deep breath, chest expanding, gathering all the dignity and memories of a time of fire and blood into his voice. His thumb placed on the PTT push-to-talk button on the yoke, feeling the coldness of the hard plastic layer. He pressed down hard. Just as the number 2 flashed on the screen, Mac's voice rang out on the radio waves, not trembling, not pleading. That was the voice of a person giving orders, a voice echoing from a heroic past that the sky seemed to have forgotten. Mac's thumb pressed deep into the PTT button on the yoke, a decisive action connecting the glorious past with the chaotic present. The radio signal transmitted through the antenna, tearing through the storm and magnetic interference, carrying the veteran's deep voice, hoarse from smoke and weather exposure. It was not the panicked scream of someone about to drown, nor was it the pleading of a weak victim. It was the sound of command, rumbling and powerful as thunder, drowning out the growl of jet engines and the wind whistling outside the metal shell. Viper 1, Viper 2, hold position. This is Ugly 6. Do you copy? The sentence was concise, succinct, not a single wasted word, ringing out in the military UHF frequency where just seconds before, there was only the deadly silence of engagement protocol. Immediately, the North Atlantic night sky seemed to freeze. The stillness enveloped the vast space, stretching to the point of suffocation. The cold countdown of the computer system on the F-35 suddenly shut off completely, as if that very emotionless killing machine was also stunned by the aura from that voice. Inside the cramped and most modern cockpit in the world of the leading F-35 fighter, codenamed Viper 1, time seemed frozen. Captain John Viper Miller, an outstanding young Navy pilot holding the power of life and death in his hands, suddenly felt his whole body go numb. His index finger, wearing a Nomex glove, was resting lightly on the 25mm machine gun trigger and the AIM-9X missile launch button, just needing a light press equal to the weight of a feather more, and the missile would leave the launch pad and turn Flight 404 into a giant fireball. But that finger suddenly stiffened, as if turned to stone, refusing to obey the brain's command. The name Ugly 6 that just rang out in the headset was unlike any call sign he had ever heard in actual operations. It was not on the ally list, nor was it in the current enemy database, but it lay deep in a hidden corner of the subconscious, a most solemn and terrifying place in his memory. Those two simple words acted as an extremely strong psychological trigger code, knocking the young pilot's mind out of the stormy reality of the present, jerking him violently back to the past of 8 years ago. At the sun-drenched and dusty Miramar Air Base, the modern cockpit scene with the helmet-mounted display system HMDS vanished, replaced by a pitch-dark tactical lecture hall, reeking of stale coffee and chalk dust. On the large projection screen was a blurry, grainy black-and-white documentary tape filmed from a gun camera of a Vietnam War-era aircraft. The image shook violently. The sky in the tape, riddled with white smoke, trails of surface-to-air, SAM missiles rushing up like venomous snakes, and 4 Phantom accompanying the formation, had been hit, one wing burning furiously and plunging into the sea in a deadly spiral. Chaos, screams, and explosions filled the audio recording. But amidst that hell on earth, a voice rang out over the radio waves, calm to the point of being chilling, cold and precise as a scalpel in the middle of a battlefield. That voice did not tremble at all. It was directing the remaining aircraft to perform evasive maneuvers, distracting anti-aircraft fire to save the parachuting pilot. Flight 2, brake left 30 degrees. Flight 3, deploy flares. I will draw their fire. Maintain formation. The instructor of that year's training course, an old colonel with a long scar running down his neck, stopped the tape right at the moment that voice spoke up. He held a ruler pointing at the pitch-black screen, his stern gaze sweeping across the baby faces of America's most elite pilot trainees, among whom was Viper 1. The entire lecture hall was silent. No one dared to breathe loudly. The instructor tapped the ruler lightly on the table, a dry sound ringing out like a judge's gavel. What do you hear? Arrogance or madness? No. That is the sound of a man who has shaken hands with death and survived to tell the story. Etch this voice into your bones and heart. That voice as hoarse as gravel grinding together. That is Ugly Six, the legend of the Wild Weasel Squad. The wild ferrets specializing in hunting and destroying anti-aircraft missiles. The instructor stepped down from the podium, walking along the rows of seats, looking straight into each student's eyes, his voice lowered, carrying the weight of history and absolute respect. The man possessing this call sign has flown into skies that even God refused to look down upon. He has saved more pilots' lives than anyone in modern Air Force history. You may be good at technology, you may fly 5th-generation stealth aircraft, but in front of him, you are just toddlers learning to walk. If one day, whether in a dream or in real life, you hear this voice ring out on the waves, shut your mouth, throw away every rule of engagement in the books, and obey absolutely, because that is the only ticket, I repeat, the only ticket to bring you back home from the realm of death. That memory was so vivid and intense that Viper 1 felt like he was smelling the gunpowder of that tape from years ago. The voice that just rang in his headset right now, amidst the North Atlantic storm, matched completely with the ghost in that tape. Not a single deviation. Still that low pitch. Still that overwhelming authority, and especially that terrifying calmness in the face of death. An impossible coincidence. According to intelligence reports and rumors, Ugly Six had disappeared, discharged, or even died decades ago. How could a legend of the analog era be sitting on a lost civil aircraft and broadcasting on UHF frequency? At this moment, cold sweat broke out, streaming down Viper 1's spine, soaking his G-force suit. His heart pounded in his chest, slamming hard against his ribs. An internal conflict raged violently. On one side were strict rules of engagement, target intruding, not responding to protocol, threatening security, fire order approved. On the other side was the teaching of the old teacher, a respect bordering on religious for a living legend. If he shot, he would comply with orders, but he might kill one of the most glorious parts of the sky's history. Viper 1, report status. Why have you not opened fire? The voice of Viper 2, flying number 2 in the formation, rang out full of questions and urgency, but Viper 1 did not answer his teammate. In his head right now, only a single thought echoed. The legend is still alive. He is right in front of me, on that big and clumsy civil iron bird, and he just ordered hold position. Viper 1's hand trembled, but not from fear of the enemy, but from fear of the very action he was about to take. He took a deep breath, dryly swallowing a mouthful of bitter saliva. He decided to bet his career on the legend. His thumb moved quickly, flipping the master arm switch hard from the arm position. Combat, ready to the safe position, safe. That action took place in less than a second, but it completely changed the situation of the sky tonight. The bright red lock-on indicator light flashing madly on the HUD screen suddenly went out completely. The rapid beep, beep sound signaling the missile had locked onto the target also fell silent. leaving a space quiet to the point of being eerie. The weapon system of the F-35 switched from attack status to standby status. The AIM-9X missile under the aircraft belly retracted its seeker head, returning to hibernation status. Viper 1 exhaled sharply, chest heaving violently. He had just cancelled a legal fire order. He had just spared the life of a target violating the forbidden zone. But deep down, he knew he had just done the right thing. He raised his hand to adjust his oxygen mask, eyes staring at the Boeing 787 swaying in the storm ahead. Now, it was no longer a nameless target bogey. It was a carriage carrying an old king returning. Viper 2, cancel fire order. Master arm off. I repeat, master arm off. Viper 1 spoke through the internal communication channel with his teammate, his voice still trembling from the psychological aftershock, but containing an unshakable determination. Inside the 787 cockpit, Dylan was still gaping, sweat soaking his forehead, not understanding what the hell was going on. Why hadn't the missile flown over yet? Why hadn't death struck yet? He looked over at Mac, who still maintained a straight sitting posture, hands holding the yoke, eyes narrowing, looking out into the darkness as if waiting for a confirmation. The silence lasted for a few more seconds, until the crackling sound of the radio rang out again. This time no longer the cold voice pronouncing a death sentence, but a voice carrying the resonance of amazement, emotion, and utmost reverence. The silence enveloping the North Atlantic sky right now was heavier and thicker than the storm clouds swirling around. In that brief but seemingly infinite moment, every sound of life seemed sucked into a black hole of astonishment, leaving only the soft whistling of wind friction against the alloy shell and the pounding heartbeats in the chests of the people holding the fate of the flight. Inside the modern cockpit of the F-35 fighter jet codenamed Viper 1, Captain Miller still sat frozen, his Nomex-gloved hands stiff on the control stick, cold sweat streaming down his spine soaking his anti-G suit. His eyes opened wide behind the helmet visor, displaying parameters, glued to the bulky, clumsy Boeing 787 swaying in the storm ahead. Just seconds ago, it was a target, a threat needing to be eliminated from the sky. But now, with the two words "Ugly Six" just ringing out, it suddenly transformed into a sacred cathedral containing a part of glorious history that he thought had been forever buried under the dust of time. Miller swallowed dryly, throat parched. He needed a confirmation, even though his intuition and heart were screaming that it was the truth. He took a deep breath, trying to readjust his chaotic breathing, trembling finger pressing the communication button. His voice, originally trained to be cold and emotionless in combat, now carried the resonance of trembling, reverence, and extreme skepticism, like a devotee having just seen a miracle manifest. Ugly Six, confirm call sign. This is Viper 1. Please repeat, is that you, on this frequency? Sir Miller's question rang out over the radio waves, breaking the silence in the 787 cockpit. Dylan, now pushed to the co-pilot seat, was still in a state of anaphylactic shock. He gaped at Mac, eyes bulging, as if unable to believe what he just heard. He waited for an explosion, a missile tearing apart the fuselage, or at least a brutal arrest order. But no, that aggressive military pilot just now, the one who just counted down to kill them, was now talking to this country. Old man with a timid tone like a cadet standing before a respected principal. Mac still maintained his straight sitting posture, rough hand gripping the yoke with a moderate force, feeling every smallest vibration of the iron bird. He showed no surprise, nor did he have any trace of smugness. To him, this was just a procedural protocol, a necessary dialogue to clear the path home. He pressed the PTT button, his voice ringing out calm, deep, and solid, not wavering at all before the authority of the war machines outside. Confirmed. Ugly Six. Military Record Identification Code 82. Bravo Zulu. I am controlling this Boeing. Emergency situation. Navigation lost. Autopilot system disabled. Requesting navigation support out of the storm zone. In the F-35 cockpit, Miller heard clearly every number in the identification code. Bravo Zulu, the Navy code for well done, and the number sequence, 8-2. That was the number of the legendary Wild Weasel Squadron of yesteryear. The last doubts vanished like fog meeting harsh sunlight. Miller felt an electric current run down his spine, the hair on the back of his neck. Standing up, he quickly flipped the master arm safety switch hard to the off position, the target lock indicator light on the screen, extinguishing completely. He ordered his teammate Viper 2 through the internal channel, voice urgent and full of respect. Viper 2, cancel fire order. I repeat, Cancel fire order immediately. Switch to escort formation. This is a level 1 order. Viper, 2 copies. But, boss, who is that? Why are we? Viper 2's voice was full of questions. Do not ask. Just know we are escorting a living legend. Fly, follow me. Miller cut in, then switched back to the UHF frequency channel to talk to Mac, his voice becoming solemn and absolutely submissive. Ugly 6. Call sign confirmed. Command center reported you had fallen in battle in 1985. But, welcome back to the sky, sir. We will switch to escort formation immediately. Please give your orders, sir. Outside the 787 cockpit window, Dylan witnessed a scene that his entire flying life had never dared to dream of. 2 evil god F-35s, sky monsters that just moments ago were bearing fangs and claws, suddenly performed a beautiful synchronized wing dip maneuver. They retracted their attack formation, turned off the afterburners, making the ferocious violet-blue flames soften into a warm orange light. They glided gently to both sides of the civil aircraft's wings, maintaining similar speed and altitude, turning into 2 loyal bodyguards shielding the old king. Mac glanced at the 2 fighter jets through the side window, a nod so slight it was hard to notice. He gave the next order, concise and full of professionalism. Copy. Maintain 2-mile distance. Report wind parameters and approach direction to the nearest airport. I will fly manually. Dylan looked at Mac as if seeing a creature from another planet. In his head, everything was turning upside down. He looked down at his crisp captain uniform, then looked over at Mac's frayed, grease-stained leather jacket. He looked at the certificates of merit, the flight certificates hanging all over his house walls, then looked at the calloused hands controlling the 300-ton monster smoothly of the old man. The previous contempt had disappeared completely, replaced by extreme bewilderment and a vague fear. He realized he knew nothing about this man at all. You, who are you? Dylan stammered, trembling voice emitting from a dry throat. Why? Why do they listen to your orders? They are the military. You are just a bottom-class ticket passenger. Mac did not turn his head. He still focused on the artificial horizon and basic flight parameters. He had no time to explain, nor did he have the need to be honored or satisfy the curiosity of an arrogant person. He just smirked, a faint smile flashing across his wrinkled face, then answered vaguely as if speaking to himself. With this plane, I am a passenger, but with this sky, I am an old acquaintance. The answer, full of hidden meaning, made Dylan even more confused. He shrank back into his seat, feeling himself becoming small and pathetically superfluous right in his own cockpit. He looked out, where the 2 F-35s were patiently flying following Mac's lead, forming an arrow formation piercing through the storm. On the leading F-35, Captain Miller had not yet recovered from the shock. He flew while stealing glances at the large civil aircraft beside him. In his head, images of the black and white tape from years ago kept rewinding. The image of the burning fighter jet plunging into the sea, and that eerily calm voice that saved the whole squadron. People said Ugly 6 was a ghost, a legend of the Wild Weasel Squad, crazy people specializing in using their own aircraft as bait to lure enemy missiles into revealing themselves. People said he had died in the final mission to protect his retreating teammates. No one found the body. No one found the black box. The name, Ugly 6, had become a symbol, a lesson in tactical textbooks that every young pilot had to memorize. But now, that symbol was sitting there, right next to him, in flesh and blood, piloting a passenger plane, overcoming the worst storm of the decade. Miller felt his chest swelling with an indescribable emotion, a mixture of respect, honor, and fear of the intense vitality of the people of the old generation. He realized that technology might change, airplanes might be more modern, stealthier, but the metal and soul of the pilot could never be programmed by computer code lines. He turned on the internal microphone, speaking softly to himself, as a final confirmation for this shocking event, a truth that would shake the entire Air Force when they landed. Oh God, they were wrong. History books wrote it wrong. That thought echoed in the young pilot's head, merging with the roar of the jet engine. Piercing through the pitch-black night, the Wild Weasel legend thought to have died 40 years ago is still alive. The deadly storm that just swept through the cockpit seemed to have left behind an eerie silence, a vacuum where human emotions were sucked dry. Outside the thick windshield, the 2 F-35 Lightning II fighter jets had completed their formation change. They were no longer predators poised to spew bullets but had become loyal guardians. 2 warm orange afterburner streams from their jet engines illuminated the night, flanking the wings of the Boeing 787, creating an invisible safety corridor amidst the chaotic sea and sky. Their presence, which was essentially the ultimate terror just minutes before, now brought a strangely reassuring feeling, as if there were war gods spreading steel wings to shelter this lost flight. In the cockpit, as the heartbeat began to slow down and adrenaline gradually receded from the veins, reality began to return to Dylan. He sat in the co-pilot seat, breathing still ragged, but his eyes had lost the wild look of the earlier panic. He looked at Thomas Mackenzie, the old man in the frayed leather jacket, who was calmly controlling the 300-ton monster with bare hands. The admiration that flashed for a moment when witnessing Mac communicating with the military was quickly replaced by another feeling, much more familiar, and toxic shame and a bruised ego. Dylan was a star, a face of the airline, someone who had never known failure or public humiliation, having to sit and watch a nameless old man, someone he had just insulted in front of the passengers, save his life and take over command, was a bitter pill he could not swallow. Dylan's brain, following the natural defense mechanism of narcissists, began working at full capacity to rewrite the memory that just happened. He convinced himself that things were not that bad, that his reaction was normal, and that Mac's intervention was just luck, or the military's exaggeration of the situation. He began to move, small but calculated gestures aimed at regaining his composure. He raised a hand to smooth back his sweat-matted hair, adjusted his skewed tie knot, brushed off coffee drops lingering on his trousers. He cleared his throat, a dry sound breaking the stifling silence in the cockpit, trying to create a falsely normal atmosphere. He needed to regain control, not just control of the plane, but control of the narrative. If he let this old man land and walk out of the cockpit as a hero, Dylan's career would end. But if he regained the yoke right now, he could cover everything up as a technical incident, and Mac was just an enthusiastic passenger helping out. Dylan unbuckled the co-pilot seatbelt, leaning towards the central control panel. The familiar industrial smile was molded back onto his lips, although it was much more distorted and forced than usual. He tried to make his voice sound grateful but still maintained a superior distance, like a boss praising a trainee employee. "All right, thanks, old man. Quite an impressive performance. I must admit you have a bit of a knack for talking to those military guys." He reached out, intending to grab the yoke on Mac's side, a decisive movement, as if wanting to snatch back a stolen toy. He continued to ramble, words pouring out quickly to fill Mac's terrifying silence, while simultaneously reassuring himself. The emergency situation is over. Those two escort guys are leading the way, so everything is simple. I will take over from here. You just go back to your seat and rest. The passengers are probably very worried. Let me handle the landing part. After all, this is the captain's duty. Mac did not budge at all. His hand still gripped the yoke tightly, knuckles white from the squeezing force, but the arm movements were soft and graceful, to keep the plane balanced in the turbulent airstream created by the two fighter jets. He did not swat Dylan's hand away, nor did he turn to look at him. He simply created an invisible wall with his silence and overwhelming aura, leaving Dylan's hand hovering in midair, daring not to touch the real power. Seeing Mac not reacting, Dylan pulled his hand back, feeling a wave of heat rising to his face. He needed a reason, a plausible excuse to explain his pathetic failure just now, a scapegoat to blame for the plane going astray, and he found it right before his eyes. The computer system. Damn it, it must be because the sensors were struck by lightning, Dylan muttered, tone shifting to the annoyance of a customer complaining about bad service. I said it. These electronic things are overly sensitive. Surely a lightning bolt hit the fuselage when we went through the eye of the storm, short-circuiting the GPS system and causing the computer to jump around. That is the reason why it did not report the no-fly zone, and also the reason why I was a little disoriented. Objective technical error only. You understand, right? Dylan's sentence was light, unloading all responsibility onto the soulless microchips. He believed in his own lie so much that his eyes began to regain a confident look. He considered the near-death experience just now as just an unlucky accident, a glitch in the software, and not due to human weakness. He looked at Mac, waiting for a nod of agreement, an acknowledgement that both were victims of technology. Have you ever met this type of colleague? Those who, when the storm comes, hide or panic to the extreme, but as soon as the sky is calm and the sea is quiet, they immediately appear, adjust their clothes, and claim credit as if they were the ones who just saved the world. They blame circumstances, machines, anything except themselves. If you have ever had to clean up the mess for such returning cowards, you will understand the feeling of contempt rising in Mac's heart right now. Mac remained silent, but it was not the silence of agreement. It was the silence of a volcano compressing pressure before erupting. He heard every one of Dylan's sophistries, every pathetic attempt to salvage the young man's face. He felt disgusted, not because of Dylan's cowardice in the face of death. Fear is a human instinct. He could forgive that, but he could not forgive the dishonesty, the denial of responsibility of a pilot. To Mac, a pilot is not just a person controlling the plane, but the person ultimately responsible for every life behind his back. Blaming the plane is the biggest insult to this profession. Mac's thumb rubbed gently on the autopilot disengage button, holding it firmly in the off position to ensure no computer command line could interfere with his control right now. He took a deep breath, the burning smell of ozone after the storm still lingering in the cockpit, mixing with the smell of cheap perfume that Dylan had just sprayed again. The sensors are not broken. Dylan, Mac spoke up, voice icy, cold, sharp as a scalpel dissecting the truth, cutting through the captain's delusional train of thought. His volume was not loud, but it echoed in the cramped space, shattering the fake atmosphere Dylan had just tried to build. Dylan froze, the smile on his lips extinguishing completely. He frowned, trying to retort. What did you say? Clearly the GPS was wrong. The screen was. I said the sensors are not broken, Mac repeated, this time slower, every word emitted clearly and firmly. His eyes were still glued to the horizon ahead, where the weak dawn light was beginning to creep through the dark clouds, but his concentration was focused on a deadly point on the control panel. He slowly released one hand from the yoke, pointing a calloused, grease-stained index finger at a small screen hidden in the bottom right corner, where lazy pilots often rarely glanced at. Look at navigation screen number 2. Do not look at the huge main screen you use to show off. Look at the smaller one, the one displaying raw data. Dylan reluctantly looked in the direction of Mac's finger. That screen displayed complex numbers and vector charts, not as intuitive and beautiful as the main interface, but it contained the naked truth about the flight status. And there, right in the corner of the screen, a pale yellow notification line was still blinking. Not a system error report, but an operational warning that had been ignored by the user for the past 2 hours. That line of text was tiny, but in Dylan's eyes right now, it was huge and terrifying as a death sentence for his career. Dylan frowned, his eyes streaked with dark red blood vessels due to tension, reluctantly moving down to the corner of the auxiliary navigation screen, following Mac's pointing direction. That was a raw data display area, where numbers danced continuously and lacked the vivid intuitiveness of the main interface, so it was often ignored by new generation pilots like him. He squinted, trying to focus on the tiny line of text, blinking weakly but threateningly. There was no system error code, no hardware malfunction notification at all. There was only an orange-yellow warning line, the color of caution that he was too familiar with but chose to ignore. Wind drift exceeded limit. Next to that line of text was a number fluctuating wildly 18 degrees, then 20 degrees, southeast direction. Mac observed every expression on Dylan's face, from confusion turning to astonishment, and finally to extreme fear, as the truth began to seep into his brain. He did not need to look at the screen to know what that number was saying. That was the language of physics, of aerodynamics, a language that does not know how to lie, and does not know how to flatter. Mac withdrew his hand, his voice ringing out low and steady like a hammer tapping on the conscience of the young captain, beginning to peel off every layer of flashy sophistry that Dylan had draped over himself for so many years. What do you see? Dylan, do not tell me it is a sensor error. The sensors are working perfectly. It is telling you exactly what has happened to us in the last 2 hours. The plane did not have broken GPS. It knows very well where it is, and it also knows very well what you ordered it to do. Dylan swallowed dryly, his throat parched like it had sand in it. He wanted to argue back, wanted to scream that this old man was talking nonsense, but the numbers on the screen kept dancing before his eyes like living witnesses. He stammered, But why did it take us into the forbidden zone? I set the standard route already. If the GPS is not broken, then why? You set the max range cruise mode for the autopilot system, right? Mac cut off Dylan's weak explanation with a question carrying extremely high damage. That was not a questionable query, but a stern accusation. Dylan was stunned. He felt like he was stripped naked in a crowd. The max range cruise mode was his golden goose. The airline had a generous bonus policy for captains who saved the most fuel in the year. That was the reason Dylan was always honored, always present on advertising posters, and always received huge year-end bonuses. He considered that resource management skill, his superior intelligence. He never thought that greed could turn into a knife held to his own throat. Mac saw through Dylan's heart, continuing his cruel lecture. Because you wanted to receive that damn year-end bonus, you entrusted the lives of 300 people to an economic algorithm. When we flew into the edge of the storm, the crosswind from the northwest blew very strongly. According to basic principles, to keep the correct flight path, the aircraft must perform a crabbing technique towards the wind to compensate for the thrust, but that action would increase drag and consume more fuel. He pointed at the fuel flow meter, where numbers were displaying suspiciously low consumption levels for a flight in a storm. Your computer system, under the direction of the economy mode, tried to keep the aircraft nose as straight as possible to reduce drag. It sacrificed flight path accuracy in exchange for a few tons of kerosene. It warned you. The system reported drifting and asked you to switch to normal manual mode or increase thrust to compensate for wind. But what did you do? Memories flooded back into Dylan's mind, clearly as a slow-motion movie. He remembered 2 hours ago, when he was sipping coffee and chatting with the chief stewardess. A soft beep rang out. A yellow warning light appeared on the main screen. He had glanced at it, saw the warning line about wind deviation, but in his arrogance and laziness, he clicked his tongue. Software error again. He had thought so. He assumed the computer was being too sensitive to atmospheric turbulence, and then, with a long, manicured finger, he pressed the clear button, shutting off that annoying warning to continue enjoying the fake smoothness. That action of pressing the button, the moment he considered the power of a commander, was essentially the moment he signed the death sentence for the flight. He had gagged the only safety system trying to save him. You turned off the warning because you thought it was a software error, Mac said, his voice no longer holding anger but shifting to deep contempt. You thought you were smarter than the engineers who designed this iron bird. You thought you could cheat physics. And what is the result? The plane still keeps its nose pointing towards the destination on the magnetic compass, but in reality, this entire metal mass is sliding sideways like a car losing control on ice. You see the plane nose pointing north, but in reality, we are drifting southeast at a speed of 200 miles per hour. Dylan was tongue-tied, his face flushed red, hot, as if burned by fire. Shame welled up in his chest, squeezing his wildly beating heart. He could not find any more excuses. No lightning strike, no sensor error, no supernatural force at all, only his own greed and ignorance. He had traded flight safety for a beautiful number in the financial report. He had let the plane drift freely for 2 hours, crossing the safety boundary, intruding into military airspace, and nearly turned everything into dust just because he wanted to save a few barrels of oil. He looked down at his trembling hands, hands he once prided on being the golden hands of the airline. Now, they looked so dirty and guilty. He glanced over at the 2 F-35s flying closely alongside outside. Those killing machines were the most vivid proof of his mistake. If not for Mac, if not for the name, Ugly Six, then by now he and 300 passengers would have become debris drifting on the cold ocean, and the cause of the tragedy would be forever buried at the bottom of the deep sea, along with the black box recording his stupidity. Dylan bowed his head, confidence collapsing completely. He realized he was not a victim of circumstances. He was the culprit. He mumbled in his throat, a late confession that only he heard. I just thought that. Stop thinking. Dylan, Mac interrupted, his hand still gripping the yoke tight, adjusting gently to keep the plane stable in the turbulent airstream behind the fighters. You stopped thinking like a pilot a long time ago. You are just thinking like an accountant sitting in the cockpit. This sky is very fair. It does not care how much bonus money you have. It only cares whether you respect its laws or not. The space in the cockpit sank into a heavy silence, with only the engine growling and wind whistling. But this time, Dylan no longer felt the fake safety. He felt the weight of responsibility crushing him. Mac turned to look at him one last time, sharp eyes boring deep into the young man's hollow soul, then dropped a cold concluding remark like a hammer nailing the coffin lid for Dylan's flashy career. You did not get lost because the GPS was broken. You got lost because you regretted the fuel and ignored basic physics. Dylan slumped into his seat like a lost soul. The hands that once beat his chest, claiming to be golden hands, now hung limply, not daring to touch any buttons on the control panel. The naked truth about greed and irresponsibility had stripped away his last bit of pride. Amidst the heavy atmosphere enveloping them, the crackling radio sound rang out. Viper One's voice, full of respect. Ugly Six. Do you need aerial refueling? Mac glanced at the fuel gauge, calculating quickly in his head, then replied decisively, not necessary. We have enough strength to limp back home. but please help me encrypt and send all the flight data just now, including the wind drift warning that was turned off, to the FAA immediately. Hearing the name of the Federal Aviation Administration, Dylan sprang up like a spring, his face drained of every drop of blood. He stammered in panic, his voice wavering due to fear. "What are you doing? Sending that data means I will be suspended permanently. Are you planning to kill my career?" Mac did not bother to glance at the person pleading pathetically next to him. He swatted Dylan's hand out of his sight, reaching out to turn on the PA system. The chime signal rang out softly throughout the passenger cabin, waking up the anxious passengers. His warm and steady voice transmitted through the speakers, soothing the fears of hundreds of people. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is an announcement from the cockpit. I am Thomas Mackenzie, a former pilot currently assisting in controlling the flight. The emergency situation is over. However, the main captain is currently encountering a number of health and psychological issues, so he cannot continue his duty. In your opinion, is the phrase psychological issues that Mac used the most painless euphemism, or is it actually the most cruel knife stab straight into the self-esteem of a man who always prided himself on perfection, like Dylan?" Sounds of sighs of relief rang out simultaneously from behind the separating door, passengers feeling secure, trusting in that strange but full of authority voice. In the cold cockpit, Dylan bowed his head down, for he understood that that announcement was a public indictment, putting a permanent end to his flashy career. Dylan slumped into his seat like a lost soul. The hands that once beat his chest, claiming to be golden hands, now hung limply, not daring to touch any buttons on the control panel. The naked truth about greed and irresponsibility had stripped away his last bit of pride. Amidst the heavy atmosphere enveloping them, the crackling radio sound rang out. Viper 1's voice full of respect. "Ugly 6, do you need aerial refueling?" Mac glanced at the fuel gauge, calculating quickly in his head, then replied decisively, "Not necessary. We have enough strength to limp back home. But please help me encrypt and send all the flight data just now, including the wind drift warning that was turned off, to the FAA immediately." Hearing the name of the Federal Aviation Administration, Dylan sprang up like a spring, his face drained of every drop of blood. He stammered in panic, his voice wavering due to fear. "What are you doing? Sending that data means I will be suspended permanently. Are you planning to kill my career?" Mac did not bother to glance at the person pleading pathetically next to him. He swatted Dylan's hand out of his sight, reaching out to turn on the PA system. The chime signal rang out softly throughout the passenger cabin, waking up the anxious passengers. His warm and steady voice transmitted through the speakers, soothing the fears of hundreds of people. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is an announcement from the cockpit. I am Thomas Mackenzie, a former pilot currently assisting in controlling the flight. The emergency situation is over. However, the main captain is currently encountering a number of health and psychological issues, so he cannot continue his duty. In your opinion, is the phrase psychological issues that Mac used the most painless euphemism, or is it actually the most cruel knife stab straight into the self-esteem of a man who always prided himself on perfection, like Dylan?" Sounds of sighs of relief rang out simultaneously from behind the separating door, passengers feeling secure, trusting in that strange but full of authority voice. In the cold cockpit, Dylan bowed his head down, for he understood that that announcement was a public indictment, putting a permanent end to his flashy career. The director turned abruptly to Dylan. The warm gaze just reserved for Mac vanished instantly, replaced by a bone-chilling coldness like the storm wind offshore. He raised the file folder in front of the young captain, his voice hardening, sharp as the sound of a hammer striking the death sentence for his career. "Do not try to act anymore. The F-35 squadron reported that you nearly took all the passengers into a live fire zone, and more importantly, the wind drift data has exposed all of your negligence. You turned off the safety warning just to save fuel to get a bonus." "Right." Dylan was tongue-tied, his face drained of every drop of blood, as all excuses became meaningless before the steel evidence. The director continued, cruel and decisive. "In my capacity as the head of the airline, I declare that you are suspended from flying indefinitely to serve the investigation. Hand over your access card and badge right here. You are no longer worthy of wearing it." Amidst the strong wind of the airport, Dylan stood frozen, his hands that were once very confident, now trembling as they reached up to his chest. He struggled to remove the gold-plated wings badge, the only pride and honor of his life, and placed it into his boss's hand. Just at that moment, the stream of passengers walked past. They looked at Dylan with apprehensive eyes, whispering about the captain who nearly killed them, then turned to shake hands and hug the old man in the frayed jacket, standing silently in the distance. The cheering sound, "Thank you," "Sir," the real hero rang out like rubbing salt into Dylan's heart. He stood isolated, looking at the sparkling badge lying neatly in his boss's hand. Understanding that his wings had been officially stripped away forever, Mac paused for a moment, glancing back toward Dylan one last time. The young captain who once arrogantly claimed to master the sky was now kneeling slumped on the cold concrete, surrounded by report papers flying scattered in the gusty wind. Looking pathetic and lonely like a bird with a broken wing, he did not need to utter any more preaching words, because the silence of the truth and the 1,000-pound weight of the badge, just stripped away, was already the cruelest sentence for the arrogant man. He adjusted the collar of his frayed leather jacket, looking up with his old but sharp eyes at the vast high sky. There, 2 F-35s roared, tearing through the mist, performing a wing dip maneuver to say a respectful goodbye before accelerating and disappearing into the horizon. He nodded slightly in return, a silent salute between old soldiers, then turned his back and walked away decisively, merging into the bustling stream of people at the budget pickup hall. He hailed an old taxi with peeling paint, completely contrasting with the luxurious first-class cabin he had just left. Leaning back into the worn cushion seat, seeking a little peace after the storm, Mac pulled a worn-down pencil from his chest pocket. He flipped to the last page of the cracked notebook, where the life and death journey just passed was recorded, and carefully wrote a brief summary line, but one soaked in blood and bone. "The sky never tolerates arrogance." The car rolled away from the airport, leaving behind the noise and fake aura, carrying the silent hero back to ordinary life, where he did not need a title to affirm his own value. The story closes here, but its echo still resonates above the cloud layers. Thomas Mackenzie did not walk out like a hero having a statue erected, nor did he need applause of acclaim. He was just a living proof showing that flashy titles cannot save human lives, and gold-plated badges will become meaningless before the cruel laws of nature. Dylan's arrogance did not collapse because of an administrative order, but collapsed before the calmness of a steely metal, something forged across the life and death line, and not through achievement reports. Somewhere out in real life, in skyscrapers or flashy offices, there are still countless Dylans using status to cover up the hollowness inside, and there are still very many silent Macs being pushed to the margins just because of a frayed shirt or a rugged appearance. The boundary between safety and disaster sometimes lies only in a moment of choice. Will we believe in the glittering shell, or believe in the true core value, not to become great men, but to remind that respect is not naturally born from a uniform. It only exists when accompanying competence and responsibility. Thank you for accompanying us and taking the time to listen to this story. Please subscribe to the channel so as not to miss emotional, inspiring stories that bring meaningful messages about human kindness, resilience, and lessons in life. We commit to always bringing the most excellent content, helping you both entertain yourself, reflect, and cherish more the values around you.